Hi guys, I'm Shelby. I'm one of your TAs for this class. I've been working with Group 2 a lot, so I've been responding to your discussion board posts and kind of talking with you guys back and forth, giving you some feedback on your assignments. And that's all done here in my room, my lovely room with my lights that you can kind of see in the background, my twinkle lights. So this week I was given the opportunity by Dr. Meyer to teach you guys about a topic that I find interesting, and so I wanted to go over group dynamics as it pertains to the movie Exam, which I found on Netflix. So I actually watched this movie over the summer, and I fell in love with it, and I was like, well, I got to come up with a topic, and I got to find a sci-fi work, and I was super excited that I could apply a lot of the information that I know to this movie that I found so interesting. So, if you haven't watched it yet, you definitely should, especially since it's a homework assignment. It's even better, too, because it's homework, so you actually get to watch a movie, and it's productive. It's not just, like, you sitting there avoiding your homework. It's you doing your homework. So, yeah, so I'm going to just start with it, I guess. Group dynamics is the influential process that takes place in groups and the discipline devoted to the scientific analysis of those dynamics. So essentially, group dynamics are the ways that individuals in a group act and react to changing circumstances. Now, virtually all human activity is done in groups. If you think about it, when we're at the store, we're at school, in a library, none of us are ever truly alone, and the only people that ever achieve genuine solitude are recluses. So to start off, I'll explain that there is a difference between a group or an entity or collective. A collective refers more to people who are around each other but don't share a common social bond of any sort. But in order to be defined as an actual group, there must be that social bond. So for our purposes today, a group must have at least two people. Those individuals must have a connection of sorts, and the connection must be socially meaningful. So our operational definition of a group is going to be two or more individuals who are connected by and within social relationships. Now, obviously, there are different types of groups based off of this definition. So we have dyads, which consist of only two people and are actually the only groups that can be dissolved if one individual leaves. So for this reason, dyads are the only type of group that are unable to be divided into subgroups. These dyads also tend to be linked by more powerful relationships, which makes their dynamic a lot more intense than other types of groups. So think the best example would be of couples. They're bound by love, which is a feeling and emotion that is much stronger than that you would be connected with when you and three other classmates are working on a group project together, or you and your lab partner are working on a project together. It's just a different level of connection. So we have dyads, and then we have our bigger groups. And although groups come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, they tend to gravitate towards the smallest size. So that's why a lot of times when you have a big group, you'll find subgroups that are forming among this large group. And it's impossible for every individual in a large group to be connected to each other. So that's kind of why they make these subgroups, so that they can connect to each other, and then everyone can be connected to a whole. A lot of times, though, more than one leader might be needed to organize and guide this entire group towards their goal instead of just one person, because there are all of these different working parts, and not everyone is completely can associate with each other. So as you can see, the breakdown indicates that the structure of a group is going to be extremely important in group dynamics. And roles such as the leader, the follower, the information seeker, information giver, elaborator, encourager, compromiser, and harmonizer are going to be commonly found in groups and necessary for their survival and interaction. There are two basic types of interactions within groups. So one is relationship interaction, and the other is task interaction. Relationship interaction, as you can guess, is just more focused on the interpersonal and social side of a group, whereas the task interaction kind of focuses more on the group's work, their plans and goals, and the behavior, that the way people interact with each other is more focused on achieving that goal versus getting to know each other and some of the more, again, social aspects that come with the relationship interaction. So for both interactions, people must still coordinate their skills, resources, and motivations to fill the roles that I mentioned before, so they can actually complete the given task at hand. Josephine McGrath has a complex model of group tasks which actually breaks down group goals into 4 basic types. So again, we're going to break down the commonly seen types of ways that groups form and kind of how they go about achieving success. So number 1 in his model is to generate ideas or plans. Number 2 is to choose a solution. Number 3 is to negotiate a solution to a conflict. And number 4 is to actually execute the task at hand. So as you can imagine, along the way, we have a lot of difficulties sort of with groups accomplishing these 4 goals. And usually that happens when someone is failing to meet their role within the group. So we're going to go to our movie exam. Take, for example, the character White. He takes on a leadership role initially in the movie when he starts talking, and he's the first one to kind of speak up and get everyone to sort of work together. And he sort of plays devil's advocate a little bit. So he starts off as a leader, and then once he starts to fail kind of at keeping the group together, and he actively starts sabotaging his group as a whole, really, he's taken out of his role of the group leader, and other individuals are stepping up to his position. And this approach can kind of be attributed to the fact that the other candidates in the room formed a subgroup of their own. And subgroups are able to exert a lot more influence on the group dynamic than an individual is able to. So they were able to kind of step in and take over when they needed to, when the group was in danger, of his actions. So you might ask why White was motivated to take the leadership role in the first place, while others happily sat back and filled in some of the follower roles. Well, the reason that people act a lot of times is based on their internal motivation to maintain and enhance their self-esteem. So individuals who exude more confidence like White and know that they have not necessarily a lot else to offer other than maybe managing, they might take a leadership role instead of actively trying to come up with solutions to a problem or coming up with examples and trials and whatnot. So they'll do that while they allow individuals who are a little bit quieter and more thoughtful to come up with other ideas for the group. And then they'll allow other people to execute those ideas. So if you look at, again, our group dynamic for the movie, Brunette took the role of information giver, while White would execute the actions as the leader. Blonde, she tended to act as a harmonizer at moments when things would get tense between all the different characters. And then Black was constantly trying to keep the group itself strong and create cooperation instead of bringing that competition back into full effect. So each individual kind of has a sense of themselves and their morals, which leads them to the roles that they take upon themselves. So they tend to act in roles consistent with their values and their known strengths in order to maintain their self-esteem. And so this whole concept of self-esteem is kind of why we also tend to exaggerate our roles in groups when the goal is successful, or we shirk responsibility to others in our group when our group fails. And I know you've seen this in your group projects. I know I've seen this in my group projects. It's a way of managing our self-esteem and our self-worth. We like to boast about our successes, and we like to kind of ignore our failures. So that's kind of where that rolls into the group dynamics and how it's kind of actually evolutionarily built into us. We do it without realizing. So in the movie exam, the group quickly establishes the roles each individual will follow. And as the movie goes on and the situations change, the group adapts their roles to follow. So this is the perfect example of how group dynamics actually works. When the goal remains the same, but the context changes, the group must be able to adapt to their changing circumstances in order to be successful. So when actions stop being productive and start being harmful, the group must take a step back and alter their approach. And this actually falls kind of in line with the concept of behaviorism and the law of effect, which is coined by B.F. Skinner. Groups will create an interdependence so that they can negotiate interactions to obtain rewards while minimizing their own personal costs. And so that's actually a reason why the group decides in the beginning of the movie to work together to determine the question. and then they decide that they'll disperse individually later on to answer the question in the competition. So that way they are all maximizing their ability to, they're maximizing their reward while minimizing their own cost. They are all going to get the question, and so they're all at the same playing field, and they all have the same chance at answering the question. It's just based on their answer that they will or will not get the job. So that's kind of the theory that they were working with at the beginning of the movie. However, towards the middle, the characters note that the content of the context of the exam has changed. And so they actually mentioned out loud that it was no longer a competition for an individual position, but rather it's a game that is being put on by the board members. So as soon as the dynamic changed and it from being individuals competing against each other to all of the candidates versus all of the board members, that's when the dynamic changed, and that's when everybody switched kind of the way that they were acting. And as soon as that distinction was made between a competitive or a cooperative situation, the group was adjusting their dynamic to best solve their problems. So throughout the movie, actually, Black was the only one who was really fighting for the group victory, and White was fighting for the individual victory, which kind of shows the distinction of the two very different stances, the competitive stance that White was taking versus the cooperative route that Black was taking. So, like I was saying, these different contexts kind of elicit different types of behaviors from individuals. And so the two main types are competition and cooperation. And actually, the Goldman article that we uploaded, you should read that. It goes a lot more into depth about how the competition and the cooperation situations influence behavior. And that's going to do way better job of explaining it than I ever will. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. But just know that there's the type of environment you are in, whether it is cooperative or competition when it comes to group dynamics, is definitely going to alter the way that you act in response to your peers and in response with your group. So, like I said, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that, but I do want to talk kind of about how this idea of isolationism can affect your behavior in a group setting, and especially in cooperative group settings. So we talked about how being in competition can be a problem, but what happens when you're in a cooperative stance and you are isolated from your group, or someone is isolated from the group? All humans, we can survive alone, but evolutionarily, we're wired to seek inclusion from those around us. So along with like food and water, a need to belong is actually one of the most basic needs that a human must meet. And this leads to the battle of balancing our own personal needs and desires with those of the group we are in. So while it's nice to be alone and relax and gain some personal clarity every once in a while, most people don't want to be alone permanently, and we're really unable to do so. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we're constantly surrounding ourselves with people and joining into groups with our churches, our clubs, schools, things like that. But whenever we can't be around people, negative things start to happen. And so that's kind of similar to when we're unable to connect with people, and that often tends to lead to conflict arising in group settings. So actually, biological influences greatly affect groups, and when conflict occurs, there's a physiological response that results. So similar to when we're angry with others, when we are isolated or excluded from a group, we'll experience a physiological phenomena that will light up the same areas of the brain that light up when we're in physical pain, actually. So the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex lights up, and that part of the brain is associated with physical pain. And that lights up, so like I said, whenever you're in physical pain or whenever you're living through a negative experience, that part of the brain also activates. So isolationism tends to activate that part of the brain as well, and it can be just as damaging, you know? But there are also, not only are there physiological costs, but there are psychological costs that come with being alone too. So our brain starts to work into overtime, and it has been well noted throughout history that individuals who are alone for extended periods of time are all reporting psychological symptoms after being alone. So whether it have been in solitary confinement for prison, scientists working in seclusion, explorers who were stranded alone, they all had these noted symptoms of increased fear and insomnia, memory lapses, depression, fatigue, and a general confusion. And so the best thing I can equate it to is in the movie, the character Death, he was ostracized for his lack of cooperation with the group. And this kind of only furthered to create tension within the group because he was failing to adopt a group role, and that results in conflict. When, like we said, when you fail to adapt to your role, or when you even fail to choose a role, that's when people start having issues and the group dynamic starts to crumble and fail. So the need for individuals to be included in a group is actually evolutionary in nature, and we need it to survive. And that's why a lot of times the need to be included will result in a drastic or a subtle change in behavior and personality. In the case of the movie Exam, the stress of the competition to acquire the job at the company is really going to drive these individuals to do things that they normally wouldn't do, along with the fact that they're isolated into this room with no outside connections or any sort of guidelines of what they can and can't really do. So it leads people to act in crazy ways. I mean, look at the Stanford Prison Experiment. When you think no one's watching you and when you have little information to go off of, you're gonna do things that you wouldn't normally do. Like you'd kill others or you'd force others' eliminations because you're looking out for yourself. It's that competition still. So we talked about coping in the first week of this class, and you guys know some of the ways that people can and will cope in stressful situations. But the biggest one that we can note in this movie is the coping strategy of dehumanization. And so the more we're able to dissociate with other human beings and their humanity, the more an individual is able to commit atrocities. Again, I go back to the Stanford Prison Experiment. These people were associating themselves with the roles of guard or with the role of prisoner. And once you take a step back and you say, okay, well, that's not Johnny from down the hall, that's a prisoner, that's when your brain kind of clicks and you're like, oh, well, he's a prisoner, so he should be treated like a prisoner. And in the start of this movie, they show that dehumanization when they go to introduce each other's names. And White automatically is like, no, let's come up with nicknames based on our physical appearances so that way we don't have any sort of connection to each other. So you end up with the characters, you end up with white, black, brown, brunette, blonde, dark, and deaf. And these stereotypes actually are what enable the group to kind of gain some sort of social connection and meaning while still, so they become one group while still kind of distancing themselves from each other in order to remain in competition and able to do what they need to do in order to get hired. And that competition actually motivates them to continue searching for answers instead of just, remaining in the room, sitting at their desks until the end of the 80-minute period. So I know I threw a lot of information at you guys, but I hope it makes sense. A lot of it can be applicable in everyday life. I know I see it in school and at my job as at my bar. It's really useful, and it's really kind of funny to take a step back and see how even in past experiences you've used these concepts without even realizing you were doing them. So this movie Exam actually exaggerated a lot of the concepts because of the environment that it took place in. Know that each environment obviously is going to affect group dynamics a little bit differently. You'll see differences in when you're working in a group project for class, when you're out on a field playing a game with your teammates, when you're doing like sports games. It's really interesting because group dynamics it's constantly changing based on the situation, but yet, even though it's always changing and it's always different, you can always bring it back to its simplest form. And so even though every single situation and every example is completely different in nature, there are certain things that will stay constant no matter what, and you can almost bank on them happening. So no matter what, when you get a group of people together who share a common goal, there's always going to be those roles that are filled. There's always going to be people who are excluded. There's going to be this idea of competition or cooperation or both, You can have intergroup cooperation with intra-group competition, and you can have it the other way around too. But all of those factors will kind of be there to motivate you to act the way that you act, which will in turn result on kind of how the way other people act too. So since we're constantly surrounded by individuals, it helps us to sort of understand the basic tendencies that we will have towards certain behaviors. So I think it's just kind of a cool concept. It was really fun researching a lot of that stuff. But yeah, I hope you guys learned something new, and good luck with your quizzes and your discussion boards. And yeah, thanks for listening.